When it comes to the theme of death in the Middle Ages, it's important to remember or to recognize that the dead were constantly a presence in people's lives. Because like most cultures worldwide, the people of medieval Europe venerated, prayed to, interacted with in various ways specific people who were dead. And these, in Christian terms, these are called saints. Saints were those who had lived lives of intense holiness and had thus been raised up by God to a special position after their death. This was usually manifested by miracles, that they were saints at all. There were miracles that occurred and to demonstrate their sanctity, and they could be petitioned, they could be venerated, they could be prayed to, and could offer help to those who remained in the realm of the living. There's a renowned scholar wrote a monograph called Living with the Dead in the Middle Ages, and it's largely about saints, and the way that those who were living interacted with the dead, and sought their favor and sought their imposition on their behalf, right? Where does this come from? A lot of scholarship has been done on the origins of the cult of the saints, or the worship of saints. This probably emerges out of polytheism. In the ancient world, of course, there were multiple deities in at least the Greco-Roman world, also in the kind of Germanic Norse world. And so those multiple deities often usually had specialties, and so if, one was trying to travel on the sea in ancient Greece or ancient Rome, they would offer up prayers and sacrifices and things to Poseidon or to Neptune. If a woman was, pregnant, she would offer up prayers and offerings to Hera or Juno, who was kind of the goddess over childbirth. And so, when the Roman world becomes Christian in the 4th and 5th and 6th centuries, and then thereafter the Germanic peoples converted to Christianity, there was a kind of transition where some of that specialization remained in place in the form of saints. No longer were there multiple deities, but there were people, or figures, I should say, holy figures, who partnered with God in a way, right? Some of the veneration of saints also probably came from the mystery cults of the ancient world, which were highly personalized forms of religion. And so the rituals were a key aspect of the mystery cults. And some of those rituals ended up in the veneration of specific saints in specific places. And so what this amounts to is, and the other point that we should make here is that people in the ancient world and in many cultures, many civilizations all over the world have appealed to the dead and sought their favor, sought their help, their intervention, as it were, in, with the supernatural realm. And so saints are that for the people of medieval Europe. How did one become a saint? Well, proximity to the divine through holy deeds, through some specific deed perhaps that one did, or maybe just the accumulation of a lifetime of good deeds could earn one favor. But it was often left up to individual communities to determine who became saints, at least early on. Later this becomes more standardized. In early Christianity, before it becomes the accepted and later the kind of official religion of Rome, martyrdom was the most common qualifier to become a saint. If a person suffered a death as a martyr, right, death in the cause of Christianity, then they were kind of on the fast track becoming a saint. And there were several key periods of persecution of Christians before the acceptance of Christianity. There's a lot more made of these, I think, than really happened. But martyrdom is a key feature of the stories that were told about these figures during that period. And so pretty much all of the early saints are martyrs. After the acceptance of Christianity by Rome, it becomes harder to achieve martyrdom, and so we have stories of Christian figures going outside of the confines of Rome to other places, trying to preach, and in a way trying to seek the opportunity for martyrdom to become a saint. But thereafter, we might say that saints are become a barometer of the zeitgeist or the spirit of the times, the most common concerns or values. And so, Christianity, in the early Middle Ages, one of the key kind of stressors or concerns of Christianity was the establishment and standardization of monasticism. And so those who were involved in the creation of monasteries and the perpetuation of the monastic system became saints. And many, maybe the majority of saints of the early Middle Ages are monks and nuns. And then later on, there are different kinds of saints. In the high and late Middle Ages, we tend to find, saints made out of like the founders of new forms of religion, like the mendicants, Saint Francis of Assisi, Saint Dominic, and others like that. But also, there are emphases or movements within kind of the vibrant intellectual culture, and so we have these figures who were writing theology in the schools, and some of them become accepted as saints. There were even there were new forms of female religiosity in this period, and so we have an increasing number of women who are becoming saints, or at least fairly prominent female saint figures. The way to hype a saint and really to get the saint recognized was through telling stories about them. And these weren't always stories about their lives specifically. Sometimes they were. And so one of the most common forms of literature that we see, especially in the early Middle Ages, but this still exists in the high and late Middle Ages, are these lives. And we might call these almost like biographies. The Latin word for this is vitae, this word right here. That's the plural. Vita would be without the E on the end, would be the singular. But people wrote vitae about saints in order to demonstrate why they should be venerated as saints. And the more widely read and widely dispersed these things were, the more commonly venerated the saints were. And we find some interesting transmissions of these texts. There are, saints in one part of Europe who the Vita somehow makes it to another part of Europe and gets read by people in a different place within Christendom. And pretty soon that saint who originated from a long way away, is venerated as a saint there, and there may even be a kind of whole community developing around the veneration of that saint. And so the Vitae have a really strong influence on this. There are also, and this is especially true for the period of our concern in this class, the High and Late Middle Ages, lots of miracle stories. Some of these occur in sermons, some of them occur in just collections of stories about saints that circulate pretty widely, especially in learned circles. But miracle stories, and most of the miracle stories are not about the miracles that saints worked during their lives. They're about things that the saints did after their death, where their relics, that is their bones, their clothing, other remains, their possessions, whatever remained physically of the saint, even things like reliquaries, that is statues or chests or things that were made to house the relics, and to commemorate the saint in some way, these have miracle-working qualities. And so miracle stories are another way that the saints, kind of get made, and then their reputations grow through the telling of these stories. This is also, again, a way that saints who were venerated in one place, could become famous in another place if those stories spread. And often we see a lot of copying where, there's a story told about one saint, and then pretty soon they're telling the same kind of story about another saint, and it becomes a sort of standardized way of thinking about saints, that, if one saint works a particular kind of miracle, say they heal someone from blindness, well, then another saint, would have to have that capability as well. And of course, the example here for all of this are the stories that are told about Jesus in the Gospels, and then later, about the others, the apostles and the early martyrs and all of this, right? So these stories grow in the telling of them, as it were. By the High Middle Ages, there is this notion that, and this is called the treasury of merit, that the saints had lived such lives of holiness that they had gone well above and beyond what they needed to do personally for their own salvation. And they, in a way, deposited goodness or holiness in a kind of bank. And that, whatever they needed to do above, or whatever they did above and beyond what they needed to do for their own salvation, was deposited in this thing that was known as the treasury of merit, right? And with all of these saints, and you can see, depictions, how many saints there are. These things just get perpetuated. Here is a mosaic, and you can see, of course, Jesus here, but then you have these other, this is St. Stephen, for instance. This is St. Lawrence here. And, I'm not going to go necessarily into the specific iconography of these things, but you can always tell a saint because they usually have halos around them, and you can see this over here as well. There are even, in the High Middle Ages, there is a figure named Saint Ursula, who was the head of a community of 10,000 virgins. And so pretty soon, it's not just Saint Ursula, it's also the 10,000 virgins. And so we've got, thousands of new saints added to this, all of whom have worked great works and whose holiness can be tapped into. And so by venerating the saint, by praying to them, by seeking their guidance or their intervention, one could then partake of the holiness that they had accumulated. Some saints were worshipped only at the local level. Some were worshipped at the more general level. And these things change over time. Saints that were very popular in one period may become less popular in a later period, or vice versa, right? There are really early saints who little happens with them, and then all of a sudden, some discovery is made. There are, bones found somewhere that have miracle working qualities, and stories get told about them, and then they're identified as the bones of some particular early saint from early Christianity or something like that, and then a whole, community will develop around that. And so those are some of the aspects of the cult of the saints. And let me just go into a few more brief details here. And then I want to look briefly at some of the texts that I assigned about this. As I said, the most direct way to access the saint was through visiting places that had their relics. And so all over Europe, there grew up kind of communities that claimed to have the bones, the clothing, some earthly possession, or some other thing, right, that was connected to a specific saint. And these things get perpetuated as well. And in some cases, one community would steal, the relics of the saint from another community and then claim that the saint wanted to move, because if the saint had not been willing, they would have resisted this and not allowed the community to steal the relics, right? And so the theft of relics becomes a quite popular thing. And so this contributes to what we might call the development of a sacred landscape in Europe, right, where there are specific places that have reputations for holiness because of their association with a saint, right? And if we look at the map here, you can see, I'll talk about what these lines mean in a second here, but there are, places listed here. Like, let's take the small town in France called Vézelay, for instance. For reasons that we need not go into here, Vézelay made the claim that they had the relics of Saint Mary Magdalene, who is identified as a key, close follower of Jesus. In fact, the first one Jesus appeared to after his resurrection, and the story is told in the New Testament. For whatever reason, Saint Mary Magdalene, who had lived over here in the Levant, lived in Jerusalem, the people of Vézelay claimed that she, after, later in her life, after knowing Jesus, had migrated over here to France, and that she died there, and that her tomb was at Vézelay. And so there are all kinds of stories told about St. Mary Magdalene and, the miracles that she worked or that were worked at her tomb by her relics. These communities are just all over the place. In Europe. And so there develop one of the key practices within Christianity in the Middle Ages, the practice of pilgrimage. This is one of the most common forms of penance, that if a person has committed a sin, they go to their priest, and the priest would say, in order to atone for this sin and to have it forgiven, you need to, do something substantial. Rather than just say a few prayers or something like that, you need to make a journey, perhaps close, perhaps far away, to one of these tombs and to make an offering at the tomb. And this would often be at great personal expense, and it could take months or even years to make some of these journeys. But that would lead to the forgiveness of sins. There were several major routes. The three most important pilgrimage destinations in the Middle Ages were, of course, Jerusalem, and lots of people travel to Jerusalem. This is one of the things that prompts, maybe the main thing that prompts the Crusades, which we'll talk about later in the term. Because, of course, there are lots of, holy places identified with the life of Jesus and the early apostles in Jerusalem and the surrounding area. And so there were major pilgrimage routes heading there. There were also lots and lots of holy sites in Rome. And so there were pilgrimage routes that were, headed to Rome. And then the third site was all the way over here in northwestern Spain at a place called Compostela, which claimed to have the remains of the Apostle James, St. James, of Peter, James, and John fame from the New Testament. Again, how his bones ended up in northwestern Spain, well, there were all sorts of stories told about how that happened. But in any case, it was believed that the tomb of St. James was here in Spain, and so there were these pilgrimage routes that went, from various parts of Europe, traveling through smaller communities all the way over here to Santiago. Santiago means St. James, Santiago de Compostela. But all along the way, there were smaller shrines with the relics of saints, and this is something that perpetuates and builds up over time, right? And so if a person were making a journey from, say, Paris to Santiago de Compostela, they could choose the route they would go, and they would visit these smaller shrines. Like they would go to Vézelay and see the relics of St. Mary Magdalene, and then they would pass through Arles to see, for instance, to see the tomb of St. Caesarius, who was an early kind of Christian bishop of Arles. Or they would travel through, and it's not on the map here, but a little town called Conques in the Pyrenees Mountains, where Saint Faith or Sainte Foy had a tomb, right? And they would make offerings at these places on their way. And so it was like a series of stops. So the journey itself was in many ways as important as the destination. This is perhaps the most common form of medieval tourism. This is religious tourism. It's traveling to holy sites. And there are even manuals that are written during this period for guiding pilgrims to one route or another. One of the texts that I assigned, I'll come back to the Saint Faith miracles in a minute here, was this, and I don't want to say a whole lot about this, but this is a text written in, I believe, the 12th century, maybe 13th century, which is, no, it's 12th century. Let's see it here. 12th century guide for the route to Santiago de Compostela. And this is just, it reads kind of like a modern, Frommer's Guide or some other tourist guide that you might buy in Barnes & Noble. And this is actually, it was intended very much for the same reason. It's like, here are the major routes. It starts out by saying there are 4 roads leading to St. James. One goes through this area, one goes through this area. Notice they mention that, one of the roads goes through the tomb of, or the site of St. Faith of Conques. Another one goes through St. Mary Magdalene of Vézelay, and these other places where people could stop and make offerings at the smaller tombs. And then they go into detail about, if you're going through here, you could stop at this place. If people get sick, then, you should head for this destination. Be careful about the water you're drinking at one point, is something they say here. They, in the guide here, they're complaining about boatmen who are trying, paid to ferry people across a river, and they're like, these guys will rob you blind, and so this is the way to make it so they can't extract quite so much money from you. And there are wicked toll collectors, and they even say, we demand that all these men who are collecting tolls should be excommunicated until they have expiated their offenses by a long and public penance and have moderated their demands for tribute. I'm not sure exactly who they were intending this for, but they're like cautioning the pilgrims to make sure you've got money, because there are people who are going to charge you tolls, and they're even going to threaten you. At one point, they come out to meet pilgrims with 2 or 3 cudgels to exact tribute by improper use of force. And so this isn't just like, well, here's the toll, you got to pay it. It's like, if you don't pay it, we're going to beat you up or kill you, and then take your money. There are even smaller shrines. We're going to talk later in the course about a figure named Roland, who was, legendarily a knight of Charlemagne, and his tomb or various shrines to Roland were venerated all along the way. And it was, like there were these stories told about figures like Roland, and part of the tourism aspect of this was that as they would travel along these routes, they would, visit the sites of ancient battles or other famous destinations that were not necessarily religious in nature, but that had a reputation, so to speak. And then, they get into some of these smaller shrines toward the end of the text here. They note here, this is page 323, also to be visited in Arles is the body of Blessed Caesarius, the 6th century Archbishop of Arles, bishop and martyr, who instituted a rule for nuns in that city. And they even say his feast is celebrated on November 1st. Each saint had a feast day, which was usually, either their birthday or their death day or some other day that was associated with their life. And so if you pass through Arles, particularly on November 1st, there will be a huge celebration going on there. That's really kind of code for that. Here's where they talk about Saint Faith or Sainte Foy, and we'll get into her in just a minute here. Here's the the mention of Saint Mary Magdalene, and then it actually goes into the story of how her relics ended up in France. Sorry, this is this the right way. And then finally there's this description, very glorious description of, the body and altar of St. James and everything that they can expect to find when they finally reach the destination that they're headed for. Okay. Now, last point, and then I want to circle back briefly and look at the Sainte Foy stuff. The making and venerating of saints was, for a long time, a kind of... It was just a common practice that developed in different ways in different places. There was no standardization to it. In the High Middle Ages, there was a process put into place known as canonization that came to be in the control of the Pope and kind of the central leadership of the Western Latin Christian Church, the Roman Catholic Church. And this process became standardized. As part of the process, they had to collect information about the saint to kind of demonstrate that the saint was worthy of being called a saint. Some of the local saints that had been venerated ended up kind of being rooted out and declared as false as the church instituted this thing called the Inquisition, which was really to look into heresy or improper belief. But they uncovered practices about saints that were deemed unacceptable. There was, for instance, in rural France, the worship of a saint known as Guinefour, and as inquisitors started to look into charges of heresy in that region, they uncovered all these stories about a figure named Saint Guinefour, and they realized after listening to the stories that Saint Guinefour was actually a dog, and there was a whole story about a dog rescuing a child, and that people then prayed to Saint Guinefour thereafter if they had a lost child. But the church kind of cracked down on this and said, well, a dog cannot be a saint, right? And so they did away with that and declared it heresy. We're running long in this video, but I do want to point out just a few things in this text about the miracles of Sainte Foy, who again was this saint venerated in southern France in a place called Conques. And I've put some artwork here on the slide. This is the reliquary of Sainte Foy from the 10th century. So this actually dates from the Middle Ages. It is still there in Conques. Conques is a small rural town, actually one of the most beautiful places I've ever been in my life. But this is the very reliquary. The community claims that the actual remains of Santa Foix, including her head, she died as a child in the 4th century. And this place, Conques, became associated with her remains, and all sorts of miracle stories were told about her. But importantly, there is also this, and we'll talk about scenes of judgment in a later, one of the later video lectures this week. But the reliquary of Santa Foix is actually depicted here in this. So this is a scene of judgment, right? And importantly, Santa Foix is shown as having gotten up from her throne. This is her throne here. And she is kneeling before the hand of God. If I can kind of blow that up a little bit so you can see the hand here. And Santa Foix, here's the throne, and she is kneeling before the hand of God, doing intercession for those who come to her community and seek her help, right? She has direct access to God. That's the message of all of this, right? And so it's not coincidental that they depicted it this way. And so if you want to end up in the nice part in heaven, which is sort of depicted in this part of the slide, rather than in hell, here you see people being tormented in hell over here, then, you come to Santa Foix and venerate her relic, her relics in this reliquary, and she will then, plead with God on your behalf, so to speak. There are several stories told, and this is really one of these collections of miracles about saints, right? This is not about Saint Faith herself. This is not a Vita, because Saint Faith died long, long before this was ever written. Again, she was supposedly a saint from all the way back in the 4th century, a child martyr who had died as a good Christian and sort of for that sake. And so I've given you this text that has like 4 stories about this, where people who appeal to Santa Foix then have great things happen to them. And there are a number of things that we can extract from this. So one of the things is we can kind of see how violent sometimes medieval Europe was. There's this story about a guy named Vibert, who runs afoul of his godfather, who happens to be a priest, by the way, whose name is Gerald. Gerald comes to him and he charges him with, some sexual sin. And then he says, well, your sentence is to have your eyes torn out. And this guy, Vibert tries to plead with him for mercy. And he says, no, I've already decided. And this priest actually himself grabs the guy and tears his eyes out. Nobody else is willing to do this. Turns out that Vibert was actually dressed in the habit of a pilgrim, meaning he was going to visit the shrine of Santa Foix, but he didn't, Gerald didn't even respect this despite being a priest. And Gerald then shows remorse about this thereafter. And then, the story follows that Vibert saw a vision of Santa Foix, and he describes, in this vision, he describes her as someone of indescribable beauty, a young girl, and she was still small, and on her head there were 4 gems. Again, if we look at this image, you can see there are actually 4 gems on this reliquary, and so the description of Santa Foix seems to be taken directly from observing the reliquary that was existing at the time that this text was written. And he says, I recognize you perfectly. In other words, I have seen your reliquary. And he does a vigil before the golden statue of the holy martyr, and ultimately his eyes are restored to him in a miracle, right? And later he sort of turns back to his carnal ways, and Santa Foix then takes his sight from him, and he ultimately has to make a resolution to do righteousness, and he becomes a monk, and then his sight is restored to him again, right? So it's like Santa Foix can take, or she can give, and she can take away, okay? Those who don't respect Santa Foix will have terrible things happen to them. There's a guy who ridicules her and even says, oh, that's just a statue, that's not really a saint, and then there's a massive lightning bolt that comes and kills this guy and his wife and 5 of their servants. So Santa Foix can be quite vengeful for people who disrespect her. So again, you can read the rest of these, but these are miracle stories. These certainly would have impressed people in the Middle Ages and made them want to venerate this particular saint. And these are perpetuated all throughout Europe with different saints. So I think that'll do it for today. Sorry to go a little bit long from what I normally do, but this is a pretty